Good morning, good afternoon. Next, we will have Dr. Latrice Rollins, who is Director of the National African American Child and Family Research Center, Assistant Professor in the Community Health and Preventive Medicine Department and Prevention Research Center at Morehouse School of Medicine. Dr. Rollins.
Hello, welcome and welcome back to the first National African American Child and Family Research Center Conference. Thank you for joining us today for the Fatherhood Town Hall. I'm honored to serve as the director of this center. And so before we get started today with this engaging discussion, I would like to share a video with you about us. This video will give you a better idea of our overall mission, vision, goals, and activities.
The National African American Child and Family Research Center is designed to provide national leadership and excellence in community-engaged research to better serve African American children and families. Funded by the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation within the Administration of Children and Families, and housed within the Prevention Research Center at Morehouse School of Medicine, the center is the first of its kind to focus exclusively on African American children and families. The majority of the research centered around African American families have been conducted using comparative research framework, where the behaviors, experiences, and outcomes of white families are viewed as the standard. This kind of framework ignores important historical and cultural context of African American life and inevitably places these families at a deficit in relation to white families. In addition, these studies have mostly been conducted by individuals outside of the African American community. The center seeks to change the cultural and institutional narratives about African American families by conducting research that takes into account our unique experiences and the social inequalities we face. The goals of the center are to advance a community-engaged and higher caliber research program focused on African American children and families, build research capacity and infrastructure to conduct research relevant to programs and policies under the administration of children and families, and effectively communicate research through a comprehensive dissemination strategy. Under goal number 1, the center will investigate the assets, needs, and experiences of African American families and children served by ACF programs. This includes temporary assistance for needy families, Head Start, and child care assistance programs. Special populations of interest include criminal justice-involved individuals, individuals with health and disability challenges, and African American residents of rural communities. The center's interdisciplinary team is diverse, inclusive, and culturally sensitive. As a part of the community-engaged agenda, the center is committed to collaborating with African American communities to develop and implement the research agenda. Under goal number 2, the center will develop and disseminate tools, resources, and approaches for the community, practitioners, researchers, policymakers, and government agencies based on the research priorities. In addition, the center will focus on developing and expanding the pool of researchers working with the African American community. We believe that training and funding researchers committed to understanding African American experiences within ACF programs will profoundly impact the nation's overall health. Specifically, the center will prioritize the development of researchers by offering the Emerging Scholars Program. The program is a 1-year-long research internship designed to increase knowledge and skills of undergraduate and graduate students interested in community-based participatory research around economic and social mobility, early childhood education, childcare, fatherhood, or social determinants of health for African American children and families. Eligible applicants will be undergraduate and graduate students in public health, social work, community development, public administration, and education programs. Scholars will receive training on research skills and receive mentoring and experience to launch their research careers. Under goal number 3, the center will implement a comprehensive dissemination strategy that communicates findings from research conducted within and outside of the center. The center will expand the reach of dissemination efforts and enhance research to practice translation through various mediums. To enhance community capacity to conduct research, the center has launched a community pilot grant program. The pilot grant program provides funding and technical assistance to community-based organizations interested in conducting research relevant to the well-being of African American families and children. Contact the African American Child and Family Research Center for more information and follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok, and all other social media outlets.
Thank you. Dr. Rollins?
So this is the African American Child and Family Research Center, which means all African American caregivers, moms, dads, auntie, uncle, granny, granddaddy, sister, cousin, friend, all family and village members need to be considered in our efforts to inform TANF and early care and education programs and systems. All are involved and impacted in one way or another. The issue of father engagement, though, in these programs needs specific attention and specific action. Despite research studies showing the positive outcomes when fathers are engaged, there are still these questions about need, relevance, importance of fathers. And it's not responsibility that our fathers lack, it's resources and respect. And sometimes there's not an ask or a lack, it's just we don't need any barriers to their positive engagement. So we thought it was important to have this town hall today to discuss when we say families, do we include fathers? When we say parents, do we mean fathers? How can we better integrate, include, and be innovative about ensuring the fathers are also engaged by these programs that they say are designed to improve child and family well-being? So I would like to introduce Dr. Rodney Washington. He is a co-investigator of our early care and education work at the National African American Child and Family Research Center, and he is also a loving father and grandfather who will moderate today's town hall. Dr. Washington.
Thank you, Dr. Rollins. Thank you all, and welcome to day 2 of the Center's conference. We have an important conversation to start here today. We have an esteemed panel of guests here to contribute to this conversation, and we're super excited to have this talk around this important topic. We have first Gabby Yearwood, a senior lecturer in the Department of Anthropology, managing faculty director for Center for Civil Rights and Racial Justice, School of Law, University of Pittsburgh. Thank you for coming. Kenneth Broswell, executive director, Fathers Incorporated. Stuart Perilliat, founder and executive director of Man to Man, Urban Youth Advocate. Clinton Boyd, executive director, Fathers, Families, Healthy Communities. Bright Sappho, senior research associate, AMEF Associates. Thank you. We're excited to have these gentlemen on board to have this conversation. We know that there's a lot of buzz that started from day one, and we're excited that we can continue this conversation. We say we give this dialogue some space today, and we ask our attendees to please use the chat as we move into this. We're going to jump right in because we know we got probably a little bit of time to discuss this huge challenge here around engagement and barriers to engagement for Black fathers. So I'm going to throw this first question out here for the group, right? So we know within the Black community, we often have these conversations around how government assistance has played a role in disrupting the formation of Black families. So for instance, many believe that participation in public assistance leaves mothers in a space of having to decide whether, the father is engaged or whether they can get this assistance. And so this is like a multi-pronged question here to start it off. Can we talk about some historical context around these policies? And is this accurate? And how do you think this has engaged with, had an influence on how fathers engage with their families? So yeah, so let's start with some historical context if someone wants to jump in on that.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think that, we can't dismiss the reality of the history between Black men and government. If you think about things like criminal justice, if you think about where I'm from, in New York State, the Rockefeller drug laws, you think about just say no to drugs, you think about the Tuskegee experiment. Black men have a relevant and justified fear of government and the history that has meant for our men and their families. And so we always hear the reference to Claudine. I don't think I've ever had this conversation without someone bringing out the movie Claudine, where the social worker played the role of an intruder into the life of a mother and her children as she was beginning to date a professional Black man. And most people might say, well, he was a trash man. He was a professional Black man who wanted to step in and serve that role. And so we still see it today. We've seen it in the past. We see laws and policy that continue to separate our families, particularly our moms and our dads, in ways that, quite frankly, even moms don't understand sometimes. We look at child support policies, and we look at parole policies, and we look at other criminal justice policies and how they play a role in separating our families. And then if we want to take it back even further, we can look at the impact. And a lot of people don't like to go back to slavery. It's an uncomfortable conversation to have, but for us, it's a necessary conversation to have. And we can look at how the infrastructure of our families have always been under attack, primarily with the focus on destroying the Black men in our families. So that's, for me, a little bit of context to how I look at the work that we do at Fathers Incorporated.
Yeah, I'd like to echo statements, and I was going to go there. I think talking about slavery needs to be part of every conversation. And so when we think about the way in which Black families were disrupted, not allowed to be through slavery, and then if we think about the apprenticeship laws and the Reconstruction that allowed people to take Black children away from Black families and put them into indentured servitude for white owners, that has continued throughout. And so the role of the military in terms of incurring pain and suffering on Black men, especially through Vietnam and into the Gulf War, I think those kinds of experiences have been a constant struggle for Black families. But I think what's important to say is the resilience and creativity that Black families and the Black community has always responded despite the constant attacks on it.
I wanted to jump in. Mr. Braswell, he hit right on when he started speaking about, the Claudine. I really actually, when I saw that movie, I didn't really understand it because I was really, really young. But as I became an adult, I got a chance to really see how advanced that movie was, because it was in the 70s. But, that policy really actually started in the 60s. And it was created because women didn't work. And so because the fathers weren't there, they had, this public assistance so that they can give the women the money that they needed for their children. But the problem that I see is that was in 1960s. Here is 2022, which we all know the policies need to change because now women are working. And we see how destructive it is to keep the man out of the home, because we already know that it takes a mother and a father, and they need to work together in order to raise the children. So now we have structural problems, and those structural problems lead into social ills, which is, you know, when the father is missing, then we all know, you know, what happens as it pertains to incarceration and substance abuse and teenage pregnancies and human trafficking and mental health issues, suicide, I mean, all of these things. And so we're still pushing this issue to keep the father out the house when it's a new year's, a new generation, things, and we're seeing how it has affected our community as it pertains to the Black community.
Yeah, just to add to the thoughtful comments of my co-panelists, I think it's just very important to re-emphasize the fact that none of what we're discussing is an accident, right? This is the result of deliberate government policies in America since its founding. And for me, I tend to approach this work from the perspective that there is an ideology that informs our policy and practice approach at both the public and private sector that gives way to these mechanisms that not only disrupts the Black family, right, but destabilizes and decimates the Black family. And a lot of that has to do with anti-Black racism, right? This cultural disregard and disgust of Blackness, and it's anti-Black racism that fueled American chattel slavery. It's anti-Black racism that fueled the backlash following the Reconstruction period, right? It's anti-Black racism that provided the foundation for the Jim Crow era. It's anti-Black racism that contributed significantly to the tough on crime policies and the war on drugs that led to a significant number of Black men, largely those who come from low-income households, to be locked up for nonviolent drug offenses, and to a point where now we have policies being created and implemented at states where marijuana is being legalized, right? And so it's just very important to put this in its proper context, that it has always been government policy that has created these barriers and hurdles that prevent Black fathers from really being as involved in their children's life as they desire.
Yes.
Yes, and I'll echo and agree with what my co-panelists have said so far. And I think when it comes particularly to some of just adding to the conversation around, contemporary policies around TANF, and the assumption, just the temporary assistance to needy families, what exactly does that mean? Does that include fathers? And the history of TANF suggests that it really doesn't. And so when you think about, for example, the fact that for Black families in particular, Black mothers who apply for TANF, that benefit is really designed for her and her child, and the state will go after fathers to get some of that money back, right? And so we have a family that's in need, but we are seeking more money, more resources from fathers who often may not have them. And so I think in general, for Black fathers in particular, they are either seen as useless, dangerous, or a piggy bank. And if they can't provide financially to the welfare of their child, to their families, then they are entirely useless, invalid as human beings, especially, and for Black men in particular. Yes, there's been a historical dehumanizing of Black men, But you look at mass incarceration, you look at just the perception of Black men as not deserving of assistance, not deserving of support, not deserving of dignity. How dare they ask for support as Black men? Like my co-panelists have echoed, there is this disdain, historical disdain of Blackness that has contributed to a set of policies that are not necessarily designed specifically to assist and support Black men based on their needs and priorities.
So I love the way this is moving, and I want to really put a pin on the intentionality around those policies. And can we, now that we've established that historical context and kind of brought it full swing, talk about now how the implications of connecting that to how fathers engage with their families as a result of this. Can we get into that part of it now?
I think that that's a difficult challenge if we don't change the perception of who it is intended for in the first place, right? Every word in TANF is a challenge for me in the work that we do, because TANF has never been meant to be temporary. It's always meant to hold us down, hold us in a continual state of poverty, right? There is no real evidence of real assistance, right? Assistance in helping people understand the challenges that they're going through, the burdens that are on their lives, and how they get through to that. There is nothing about us, Black people in particular, that's needy. We've used that word. We understand what needy means. Needy is an irritant, right? Is an irritant person who's asking for something that they don't really deserve, right? And then, and families, we're gonna spend the next hour and a half dismantling the whole notion that this was meant for families. It was not meant for families. And so if you look at it from that perspective, and you look at it from our current state of posturing around having this conversation, the old perception is the current perception in terms of who we are or who they intend to work with, deal with, and to give services to. So until we have an impact on how policymakers, legislators actually see both our Black mothers and our Black fathers, and then an extension of them, our Black children, we're going to continue to have to deal with the expectation of who they think we are, not who we are.
There's families, generations of families, and it starts maybe with, Big Mama that was on public assistance, and she was raising her children on it. But then they found out that they can transfer that over, that public assistance, that Section 8, to the other generations that's coming after them. And, it becomes a way that it's comfortable, but they say, well, we're helping you, but it's not really helping us. It's never really helped us, and when you flip the script and you talk about men and getting public assistance, which we don't have that conversation, but there may be a time when the father may be down and may not have the means of taking care of his children, but may have custody of his children. But they frown on him. It's not equally where he gets the public assistance or the whatever he needs in order to take care of his children. So there's a bias there as well. It's when you start getting dependent, where you start saying, hey, you can have $350 per child, and you can have 4 or 5 children, and it begins to add up, and all you have to do is stay home. But there's only one catch to this. You can't have the father in the home. Well, let's say the father wants to be engaged, and something that all the panelists were speaking about was this poverty thing, because in order for you to even get that assistance, you have to live beneath the poverty level. you know, so they're going to keep you there, and they're going to check you every year and reevaluate you to see if you remain in that status. It's again, it's a policy. It's a system, and I always say it's a 1950 system in 2022 that's broken, and no one wants to hear or even explore ways to fix this broken system.
Yeah, and so I'll say that I think that's a great question, because we can't, we'd be doing ourselves a disservice if we did not bring attention to the reality that relationships are impacted by policy, that people engage their relationships in ways that they don't even understand are affected by policy. And so absolutely, if a father is not able to provide financially for his children, or he's not able to pay child support, there are a number of reasons why he may disengage entirely from the whole situation. You know, he has child support coming after him. He has the state coming after him. Not only may he disengage from his co-parent, but he may disengage from the workforce. Like this may, he may completely go underground, because the kinds of funds that are taken away from low-income fathers to pay child support, the proportion of their income that's removed is really high. If you're a high-income father, yeah, you're losing some money, but you can still survive. A younger father will have trouble surviving. There's a lot of expenses he may not be able to handle. So it may become in his best interest to survive, to entirely disengage from his family, right? And that is something we really don't want. As my co-panelists mentioned, even the whole notion of what we think of in terms of fatherhood, the way a father can contribute to the development and growth of his child, the way he can contribute to his household, him just being in the house, being a caring and supportive figure, not only has implications for how that child may develop over time, but also removing some of the parenting burden from the mother of that child. That is immensely huge, and something that I don't think our policies are respecting quite enough.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful point, especially the in terms of talking about the role of poverty, right? Like that we're working with a system that sets a particular norm of defining what counts as family, and then what counts as a successful family. And it's always this sort of nuclear model of a husband and a wife, father is the bread earner, and anything from that or changes from that gets negated, right? And what we see is these policies that disenfranchise, like don't recognize where things can happen. Pay Black women more, would change a big thing. Actually help people get out of poverty would be a big thing. But that's not going to happen under these policies. And I think it's really important to recognize the way in which, people were Black, the Black family and Black communities are having to respond to a standard that they didn't create. And that everything that they have to deal that counts as success, the system is set up for them to not succeed, right? So that for a young Black boy to think about the label of father, they have to think about the leading wage earner. They have to think about leader of the family. But if everything in society, education, popular culture, everything they encounter tells them that they're not worth enough, and they don't give them the tools and the abilities, don't support them, don't love them, so that they can become successful in whatever ways they want, then how are they supposed to exist in this particular kind of policy setting? It's impossible.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Brother Clint, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was just going to quickly add that, I often think about this within the context of like the politics of personal responsibility as well, right? And that whole misleading, harmful narrative that suggests that, our fathers you know, like the financial insecurity that our fathers experience and their poverty is a result of some type of moral failing, you know, bad choices they make, you know, irresponsible behaviors as parents, right? Whereas the opposite is true. And I think that's what everybody on this panel is speaking to. You know, the focus on personal responsibility conceals the structural factors like inherited disadvantage, you know, historical discrimination, racial segregation within the labor market, et cetera. And again, just blames the fathers for their personal struggles rather than the policies that have resulted in a lack of shared prosperity, right? And there's just so much work to be done in that space in terms of changing the narrative, because as someone who provides direct services to these men, right, who hears more about not just their individual stories, but how their individual stories are connected to a collective narrative of the hundreds of men who come through our doors, right? It's very clear to me that we don't have bad people, we have bad policies on the books, right? We don't have problem or troubled fathers. Our fathers have problems because our policies do not affirm their humanity, do not value them as assets, and do not recognize them as being positive contributors to the overall healthy development of their children.
That is a great segue, Brother Glenn, into, I was going to get into negative narratives, right? In this next part, because the way, you know, this conversation is moving is super helpful, because, you know, people want to create policy around something that they think that they can remedy. And so if you generate all of this information saying that Black fathers are in this space, then we need to do something about that with more punitive kinds of policies, or what does that look like? Can we talk a little bit about that? Because this, I think, thank you all for how you all are sharing and contributing. I wish as a young dad, I could have had this conversation, you know, with a group of brothers myself. But, you know, can you all get to how these policies, can we talk a bit more about those negative narratives and how they can drive these policies, you know, that really become barriers and exclusive, that doesn't include Black fathers?
I think something important to give in terms of context is former Senator Patrick Moynihan's report on the Black family in the 60s. And here is a guy who is a PhD sociologist who did research on the Black family and consulted with the White House. You know, he advised Reagan, Johnson, Nixon. He mentored Bill and Hillary Clinton, who set in motion a lot of the policies that everyone's dealing with now in the 90s under his tutelage. And it was a direct criticism of Black men and Black women. And, you know, the response was Black men need to get sent into the military to become stronger, right? That they're weak because they have Black women supposedly leading households. And I think that started generations of negative stereotypes and policymaking of, you know, of politicians throughout Congress referencing this as, oh, this is what the Black family is, based on this one person's supposed research, right? And those policies have been in place and have that document has been the key to the war on poverty, the war on war on drugs.
One of those negative perceptions comes, you know, where they talk about more than 70% of Black men are Black children are fatherless, and how, you know, we're supposed to be deadbeat dads, and we're lazy, and we're not engaged, and we're not involved, and we don't want to have relationships with our children. And even with the data for Center of Disease Control and Prevention, that's where that comes from. And then they feed on that, and they say, well, you know, fathers don't want to be engaged in their children's life. Black men don't want to have anything to do with their children. Well, that's not the case. They don't take in consideration those that had died, that was in that count. They didn't take into consideration when they did that census report, just because the father wasn't in the home did not mean that he wasn't present and actively engaged in his children's life. So there was a lot of missing variables, but they took those false or that myth where they did not show that Black men lead all the races as non-custodian fathers, then all the other, they don't talk about that, and so, when you talk about these policies and how they're created based on this false notion of what people say, that we're not engaged and we're not loving our children, or we don't want to be actively engaged, or all of this is really false. The men that participate with me, now they may not have the skills to be able to father their children for the reason they may not had a father, or they may didn't have a male role model, or they grew up on the streets, so they got a false identity of manhood. But that does not mean they don't want to be engaged in with their children. They just don't know how.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you touched that point, Stuart. You were in my head when you quoted that, because I think one of the things that we have to do, even in our own spaces, right, as people who provide direct services, do some level of research, we have to be and have a little more clarity around the terms that we use, because the terms that we use sometimes can be just as deceiving as how people see us, right? And so when he speaks about that particular data point that kind of talks about, it's a little less than 73% now, but 73% of Black children are born into out of wedlock homes, he's absolutely right. Just because they're born into an out of wedlock home does not mean that dad is not there. It just simply means that the mom and dad is not married. And no one wanted to go deep enough to actually be able to pull that apart and actually begin to talk about that, which leads me to something that Gatsby was talking about, the Moynihan report, which is, I always have to remind people, because we do a lot, I have actually named our research institute the Moynihan Research for Fatherhood Research and Policy. That paper was not a research brief, it was a report. He wasn't doing research, he was reporting on what he saw. There's a huge difference in those two things. And so you look at it and you view it as a framework for what existed in 1965, not what he researched. And so that's why it's comfortable for me to use it as a benchmark to being able to establish what we see today. And I'll end with these kind of other two short terms that drives me crazy. The other term that drives me crazy is this usage of fatherless, right? Because there is no such thing as a fatherless child. 100% of all biological children has a father in their lives. The question is, he could be deceased, he could be incarcerated, he could be deployed, he could be on 50-50% travel, he could be all kinds of things. The question is not if he exists, the question is where he exists. But if we consistently keep asking the question if he exists, then it gives us the space to ignore that he does exist, right? And then the last one that kind of drives me a little nutty, and we were talking about it earlier, and I was going to kind of piggyback on what Clinton was talking about, because I said it to myself and I was like, man, I got to remember to mention this. Like when we speak about dads and when people try to frame dads and their actions with respect to not being in their children's lives, they always use the term running, right? And whenever you use that term running, people attach that term to that the moment the child was born, he began to run or he ran, which of the fathers that we work with, I have never met a father who was running from his responsibility, but I have met thousands of fathers who were escaping the situation and the narrative that was unbearable to him, to give him the self-esteem to be able to understand whether or not he could be a responsible father. And when you catch a dad with that understanding that he was trying to escape something as opposed to running from something, there's a different level of work expertise and empathy that you have for him to help him understand What he's running, what he's trying to escape from is something that he can't escape by himself. And there's a whole body of work and a whole body of men and women around the country trying to deal with what he's escaping from, not from what society says he's running from.
Yes, I just, Brother Kenneth, thank you for all of that, because I think you were in my head a little bit just now. So just as far as the terminology, because when we think about where some of these assumptions come from, I appreciate folks bringing up the Moynihan document, because this goes back even further than that. When you think of Black people and Black men in particular, we have historically been seen as a group in need of moral redemption, in need of moral guidance, in need of education, because we're sort of savages, right? And so the given is that we need some level of guidance, or some level of restraint. And so just sort of piggybacking on the idea of language, or the kinds of language we use in policy. And I know folks have different opinions about this issue, but one of the things that comes up is just the way we use the term responsible fatherhood, right? Responsible fatherhood, suggesting that folks who need to be in this program were not responsible in the first place, right? I know that's not the narrative across the board, but just the way we use that language suggests this really deficit sort of driven modeled way of looking at where fathers are. And I'll echo what Kenneth said about fathers. Not only are these fathers, these aren't deadbeat dads, right? These fathers really want to be engaged in their child's lives. And not only that, Black men in particular, poor Black men, some of the things they have to deal with in order to get that, in order to engage in that role as fathers. They have to deal with child support. They have to deal with the family courts. And they lose so much income in that process. I know a few fathers now that have to travel across states just to see their child because their mother moved out, and because they don't have parental rights, she can do that, you know? And so this idea that fathers are deadbeat or that they're absent is really false. But also, I think the notion of a deadbeat dad is really easy for policy, because you can justify so many bad policies with the assumption that men are deadbeat dads, or that they're absent, or that they're running, or that they're trying to escape responsibility, because then you can justify punitive policies that put dads in jail for not paying child support, that take away driver's license from fathers for not paying child support, right? That remove their ability to actually provide. You can justify these policies. This is historical. This has been going on for a really long time. The practice of justifying bad policy with really false assumptions. Thank you.
Wow. Right. Can you put your Cash App down on the lower left-hand corner?
Yeah, just to add to that real quickly, for me, it just comes to this whole piece around our policy framework here within the United States. We claim to be a nation of redemption, right? We claim to be a nation of rehabilitation, but our policy framework is predicated on retribution, right? And when you think about the various systems our fathers are forced to engage with at every phase within the life course, right? You can look at all of the statistical data points that suggest that Black boys, all the way until they become Black men, all the way until they become Black fathers, do not have the best relationship with our public systems, right? And specific to our conversation with fathers, it's very evident when you think about, the various policies that we, that kind of regulate our lives. If you're thinking about like child support, you're thinking about mass incarceration policies. These are all punitive policies. These are all punitive systems, right? And for me, it's just very important to acknowledge that I just have to say it, white ain't right. And we have to look at who is coming up with these terms, who are the individuals putting these systems in place, and do they truly represent the best interests of our people, right? Because I think the historical record has shown that that is not the case. And we just have to be very clear about what we're up against, who are the opponents to our rise as a people, and think very deliberately about how we need to craft a solution to these vexing social problems that have historically kept us behind the 8 ball.
Let me jump
If I
in
could
here
just
on
have
this one. I want to kind of watch our time. This is a great conversation. I think we got to Brother Chris's point around this myth around absent fathers. I think Brother Bright touched on that one. I want to move us into this area of custodial rights for fathers, right? And talk about that, because that differs in different states. But how can Black fathers begin to navigate that, to a space of advantage, for them? Can you all start to speak about that, about navigating custodial rights in this system in trying to engage more with your child?
That system from the beginning needs to be father friendly. And it's not. When you talk about social services, when you talk about child support services, when you talk about, let's say there's a father who has been taking care of his children and owns his own business and is a provider, and then he falls on hard times and he can't afford, now watch this, he can't afford to pay the expectation that they put for him. And then because he can't pay that expectation that they set for him, then they want to take his driver's license, his professional license. Now listen to me. I've met with the director of child support services and had a conversation with her about, okay, how can we work this out? It's not, because we always say it's about the children, but is it really about the children, or is it about the money? Because if you have the fathers who's really actively engaged in their children's life and really have shown and has a track record, and then he can't meet a need, why would you take away his livelihood? The money that what helps him to take care of his family, why would you strip that? So if we're going to talk about anything as far as custody and working with the systems, all these systems need to be father friendly, because when a father's sitting down and he's going through mediation, how many men do he see that are mediators? When he's having conversations with the people at child support services, how many of them are advocating for the man, or even saying, hey, look, how can we make this father friendly so that, you go to parenting classes, you see nobody but women, you said, but this is for families, really? Where's the men? Where's the men that's advocating, even with the mental health issues? When you talk about mental health, there's not mental health experts that look like us, so they can't identify our culture. And that's the piece I love this conversation, because when we talk about, even with the judges that are making these decisions, now listen to this, the judges is making the decisions, most of them don't look like us, and they don't know about our culture, but they're making the decision in 10 minutes that will affect the rest of our children's lives. This is just crazy. So if we're really going to talk about policies, systems, engagement, custody, a lot of times men check out. They say, you know what, I just go make another family. I just go, because why should I just deal with this? And I got to deal with the mother. I got to deal with the courts. I got to deal with trying to get an attorney. They taking my money. You know what? I'm just going to go ahead and make me another family, not knowing how that hurts. And I don't think they do it, on purpose, but that's what happens, because they're tired of being beat down. They're tired of, not really having a fair shake. You know, I'm trying to do everything I can to be engaged in my children's life, and all the odds are against me and the barriers.
So I want to say that fathers navigating these systems, right? I think there are there's some work that they can do, but we can't dispel the fact that they are facing a behemoth that they may not be able to fight on their own. And so I think we really need to think about, because fathers want to be dads, we know that. But what is standing in their way? It's like a dragon outside of a cage. And so what is it that we need to do with that? And I think that child support programs, for example, there is some room for some shifting there. And I think that there have been some organizations, I think the Minnesota Child Support Office, for example, has done some work around this, at looking at their data, looking specifically at the way it's impacting their Black and non-custodial parents, which are predominantly fathers, thinking about how we can improve these services, how we can improve the way this organization works in terms of collecting child support payments, how we can get child support offices more interested in the parenting time aspect of child support, and not so exclusively focused on just getting payments. Some of these fathers are paying lots of money in child support, and the child support office has nothing to say about how to get those fathers more engaged in their children's lives. There was a recent demonstration called the Procedural Justice as an Alternative to Contempt that has helped child support offices fund a position that has specifically designed to work with people in depth in order to make sure that they're engaged in a way that's neutral, that's fair, and that is incorporating the interest of some of these fathers. So I think there's a lot of work that some of these institutions can be doing that they're not doing right now.
I think in response, in continuing the conversation around the behemoth, it's also the legal system, right? The laws that are in place are based on a very narrowly defined set of parameters that if you don't fit within it, you have no chance in it. You know, I know someone who, in attempting to get custodial rights because the mother was vindictive, he ended up in jail. And he ended up in jail because his public defender was asleep in the courtroom. And so where are we finding good legal advice where men who want to be fathers or be engaged in their children's lives have good legal support, good understanding of the law, knowledge of the law, but that's a lot to expect, right? Lawyers aren't cheap, and gaining knowledge of the law is not easy. And so where are the systems that allow for these men to get the support so that they can have equal rights to their children when they are actively seeking them?
No, we want to be. I'm sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we have to be more intentional about what we're educating our fathers in, right? And so, in Atlanta, where we're serving these dads, I think the state of Georgia has probably the most draconian policy and law in place of any other state called legitimation. In the state of Georgia, if you are not married at the birth of your child, the state does not recognize the dad as the father of that child. Child support can come in and establish paternity and place a child support order on him, but that father cannot go to court for custody and parenting time because he's not the legal father of his child. That's a legal barrier, not a policy barrier. It's a legal barrier that they have to go before the Superior Court in Georgia to be deemed the legal father of their child. There's nothing more dastardly than telling a father that we're going to recognize you as the father because of your DNA, but you're not going to be able, the state doesn't recognize you as a legal father until you go through this legal process, which costs money, serious money, particularly if there is a the mom does not agree with them being legitimizing their children. And so what we do is we really spend a lot of time in helping dads really understand that the way you navigate and be the system is to understand the system, be educated about the system, to be able to walk into the system having a level of knowledge and leaving your emotion on the table. Don't go in having emotion about what you're getting ready to face, because that emotion, based on some of the things that you guys have already said, is going to get you in trouble, right? Walk the line, walk the rules, do all of those things. And then secondarily, we're going to be here to support you through the process and after the process. So don't feel like you're going to be left alone with the dragon, because that is the biggest fear of our dads walking into, again, another governmental space, feeling like everything is stacked against them. And so when it comes to all of these policies, there's a level of work that we all have to do, but there's a level of, I want to call a big hug we got to put around our fathers so that they can walk through this overwhelming system, because it's not just one system, it's a multiplicity of systems. And this is the thing that they're trying to escape. They just want peace in their lives. They want to be able to spend time with their children, and they want to be able not to have to worry about, if I miss a payment, whether or not someone is going to take my ability to see my children, turn my lights off, take my car, foreclose on my house, whatever those things are going to happen when child support steps into your life. And so I think there's kind of two tracks that we have to move on as it relates to policy. And that is, what do we do and what is our proof of concept in terms of why we believe these policies don't work for our fathers based on what we see in working with our fathers, and then being able to tell the narrative of our fathers. Because what we know, there's an old African proverb that says, as long as the hunter tells the story, the lion's story will never be told. And we allow the hunter to continually tell our story, and we don't tell enough of our story or the narrative of what is happening in our community to do what I describe as bringing humanity back to fatherhood. Because the heartstring has become disconnected from dad. And somehow we have to find a way to bring that humanity back to a space that so deservingly needs it.
Let me jump in here right now and do thank you, Brother Kenneth, because I want to use this last couple of minutes before we open this up to our attendees for Q&A to really talk about, that piece you just spoke about, educating, what are we educating, dads on? There's a lot of things that were happening, I can remember myself, they told me to save all your receipts, save all your receipts. You had all this big stack of receipts. Judge didn't care nothing about those receipts, not a thing. And so what can we start to tell, particularly young dads that are entering into this process of fatherhood, that can show them how, we know it's a systematic theme, Brother Clinton talked about, intentionality in all these processes that you all have mentioned. What can we tell these brothers and educate them on to begin to navigate this system to sort of lessen some of this burden and put them in a better place? Can we talk about that for the next couple of minutes before we open this up? And I want to tell our attendees, please put your questions in the queue for our great panelists. So when we open this up, we can get them to address them.
I think Kenneth hit it on the nose. I mean, he hit it on the head. The emotional piece is a major piece, because, we're emotional people. Black people are emotional people. Not that we're mad or angry, but we're sometimes we communicate differently. And they perceive that communication as being angry or frustrated. So that the first thing they want to say is, in order for you to get your children, you're going to have to go to anger management class, and they send them to anger management class or, parenting classes. But the problem with the parenting classes is they don't look like us. The parenting classes are not conducive for our population. And so, that's one. The other thing is, as he's talked about the legal sense, I've heard a lot of, talking about legal. The legal thing is, in California, it's $500 an hour. for an attorney, you know. and you know, you have these young men that do not understand the law, and so they may be spending time with their children. Now watch this, they may be spending time with their children on a regular basis, and picking them up from daycare. Like the mom might drop the kid off at the daycare at 7 o'clock in the morning. The father may pick them up at 2 o'clock. He takes them home, feeds them, you know, gives them a bath, put their pajamas on, and then the mother gets the overnight visits. So it's like he didn't spend any time with the children because it's based on overnight visits. But the father doesn't know that. So he's really actually on paper looking like he's only spending 37% of the time with his children, when really actually he's spending just as much as, if not more than the mother, but he doesn't know that. And so the problem, what I would really like to tell a young man is that he's gonna have to continue to be consistent, and he's gonna have to understand that the policies and the rules are set there. But the problem is the rules keep changing. So when they're living and they think they have this rule and they understand it, the next thing you know, they throw them another barrier, they throw them another change. And you know, because he doesn't have representation, you know, but what he could do is he can go, I don't know about the other panelists here, but in California, all throughout California, they have self-help. You can go and go for free and get your papers filled out. You can get, maybe they won't give you legal advice, but they will give you everything you need and print it off, give you a set to take to the mom. And you know, if you're on public assistance or low income, you get fee waivers. So all of those things will help the young man as far as him getting custody, because he'll realize, okay, now I'm at least starting the ball, I'm starting the process. But he's going to have to understand the law. He's going to have to understand the law. He's going to have to, and it may take a little time, and it gets frustrated and you want to give up, but don't give up because, you know, your children's at stake.
Yeah, you know, as Kenneth and Stuart were alluding to in their remarks, I think this needs to be an intentional component of our program models at our respective fatherhood agencies, right? To make sure that we are deliberately equipping our fathers, young men in particular, with the knowledge, the insight, and the tools they need to better understand how these various systems operate, with the hopes of developing some type of organizing and advocacy plan so we can change policies and laws that continuously create hurdles and obstacles and disrupt the Black family, right? That's something that we've historically done at Fathers, Families, and Healthy Communities. And honestly, that was one of the main reasons why I was eager to take over as the executive director, because there's a history in us, you know, bringing fathers together, utilizing a racial justice and equity framework to work with those fathers to identify goals, you know, various other considerations that they may have as it pertains to what they feel that what the barriers are to father engagement, and recognizing that there may be some constituents and allies that we can work with to advance a collective goal and objective, identify who those decision makers are, and develop tactics and strategies that rely on our ability to organize as a people, right? You know, I think that's also a big piece of it as well. And in my personal opinion, and a lot of the research literature that I read substantiates the point that I'm about to make, that in many cases, part of the reason why there's this conscious and deliberate effort to keep the Black father disconnected from the Black unit as a whole is because strong Black families lead to strong Black communities, right? And it leads to strong Black nations, right? And I also believe that when we have conversations about the Black family from a strengths-based perspective, right? When we have conversations about Black fathers from an asset-based perspective, we have to recognize that our history did not start in 1619, right? Like we come from sacred, royal, ancient tradition prior to colonialization, right? And there are some programs that exist that do a good job in connecting Black fathers to the history that we lost, not completely, but they've attempted to keep away from us through the Middle Passage, right? Because self-knowledge produces self-love. And the extent to which we can pour the right knowledge and the right information into the minds of our fathers is only going to equip them with all of the tools they need to really deal with the issues that confront us today.
The things I would like to add is something Clinton said earlier. One is having them understand that where they meet barriers and struggles and feel like they're failing, that it's not individual responsibility, that they're dealing with institutions that are designed for them to fail. And I think we have to start all of the knowledge and all the education, all the conversations before they become fathers. Because it only takes one, very short moment to all of a sudden become a father, right? Where, two people have an encounter and then all of a sudden you find out, oh yeah, by the way, you're going to be a father, right? And not that it always happens that way, but we can't wait till they become fathers. We have to equip people, young people, with an understanding of their whole selves as individuals who are engaging in intimate encounters with one another that might lead to them becoming parents. And so they need to understand all of the things that go around in terms of feelings, desire, all of those things early on. And we need not keep that information away from them. We need to educate them properly. When I teach my large classes, and across the board, they have very little in terms of sexual education, right? In terms of fully understanding the emotional context of what it means to engage that creates children for people to get this title of father or mother or parent. And so I think we need to have conversations early, openly and honestly with the children in our lives about what that responsibility might entail for them, that prepares them when they make active choices to intentionally become parents.
Brother Gab, I want to know more, and you and panelists as well, because I think that's the innovation part of this conversation, right? How early should those conversations happen, and in what kind of spaces? You mentioned that around sexual education and those kinds of things, but I'm curious to hear from this group as in panel attendees. The chat is open if you have questions, but I really would like to know about the innovation in that, like how early, given the magnitude of the in context that you all have described in this conversation, how early should those conversations happen, and in what kind of spaces to young men, young women too, to talk about the implication for having children?
So one thing I want to mention that I don't think we talked about yet is that fatherhood and the way fathers consume information and the way Black men in particular consume information has changed dramatically. A fatherhood program will likely not be the first source of information around fatherhood for many fathers. There are influencers, there are Instagrammers, there are YouTube educators. These guys are listening to Boyce Watkins, they're listening to Kevin Samuels, they're listening to a lot of folks who don't necessarily make it into our circles all the time. And what are those messages looking like? Now, as far as, so one, I want to acknowledge that fathers are getting information about fatherhood, they're getting information about relationships. But as far as when that needs to begin, look, being a father is something clearly that will impact the rest of your life. It will have, and unfortunately, I got to acknowledge this, having a child with the wrong one could really put your life in a tailspin. And as soon as men have the ability to do that, or shortly before that is when I think we should start the conversation. We already have sex education classes that talk about how to avoid HIV and how to avoid these STDs, these consequences of sex that have implications for your entire life. A child is one of those things. Now, I know, some of these, some of these sorry, my battery's dying. Some of these programs have done some of that work. But as far as talking about some of the real responsibilities of parenting, the real responsibilities of coordinating with a co-parent with the goal of raising a child is something that we should be incorporating in those conversations as well.
Yeah, right. I think that it goes back even a little further, right? I think it goes back further, and here's why I believe it goes back further. The lessons that we learn and understand start with how we're taught, how we learn and understand the kind of men we are, right? And so I have 4 girls and I have a 13-year-old son. And my conversation with my girls has historically been, I can tell you the kind of father he's going to be by the type of man he is. That if he is a dastardly man, he is probably going to be a dastardly dad. If he is an unresponsible man, he is probably going to be an unresponsible father. So if you want to look for the best kind of potential father, you have to be able to assess what kind of man he is. And from that perspective, that's why it's so important that fathers are engaged in the lives of their children as early as possible, right? The research says that 85% of low-income couples are still romantically involved at the birth of their child. At 1 year, there is no significant difference in engagement between a non-married couple and a married couple. However, by year 5, the non-married couple are less likely to be together than the married couple is together, which means something happened between year 2 and year 5 that we have to examine, and we have to figure out a way, how do we strengthen relationships in year 2 to 5 so that these fathers and moms are more likely to remain in a co-parenting relationship post their children going to school, right? Because that's when the real stuff hits the fan, right? When you have to enroll your child in school, when you have to identify a doctor, when you have to go get shots, when you have to start thinking about what spiritual space your children are going to learn from, we have to really start thinking about and talking about discipline, expectations, where the child is going to live, all those kinds of things, right? And so if you're not dealing with the kind of man or girl that you're trying to raise as parents, you're gonna have that much more difficulty when it comes to them beginning to think about being parents. And we are sum totals of how, as parents, we are sum totals as a result of how we were parented, right? That's what we bring to the table. We bring to the table of parenting how we've been parented, right? We've heard this dysfunctional comment made over and over and over again as it relates to discipline. My mom beat me and I turned out all right. Well, let's examine for a minute your definition of all right, right? And so we really got to get to a space where we're looking at the transition of our children into teenage or pre-puberty, and then into young adulthood and into the space where they become more dependent in their own lives.
Well, Rodney, you said how young as they begin to comprehend the conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. It's,
if they start asking the questions, then that lets you know.
Right.
I think my daughter was about 2 the first time she asked, where the babies come from, and I had to figure out a response that matched, right? That wasn't made up, that wasn't about storks. And I think that then began long conversations and future conversations.
Yeah. And I think that we've gotten to a lot, we've covered a lot here. And I appreciate, the depth at which you all have discussed this. I want to get into some of those practical kinds of things, since I don't see any questions in the chat, around, how do you think, Brother Bright mentioned, how social media and all of those things, sort of drive and influence. Can we talk a little bit about that? How those things around how information and what trends and all of that, and toxic masculinity and all of that kind of stuff, kind of fizzle into that process. And so if there are questions in the chat, I want to bring them forward. I don't see any at the time.
Yeah, all the questions are in the Q&A. You have to hit the Q&A button. All the questions are in the Q&A. But I will start by making this statement, and that is, we all have to first understand that social media is a highlight reel. It's not a low light reel. Like the low lights of our life are not being broadcast on social media each and every day. The reality of the struggles that we go through and the depth through which we go through those struggles are not played out on average on somebody's Facebook page, TikTok, or Instagram page. So we got to release ourselves from believing that social media at any point could serve any benefit to our lives in terms of therapy, legitimation, credibility, or esteem. Because social media and the internet is the most notorious destroyer of those four things if you don't understand what you're watching from day to day.
Yeah, and I'll echo that and say that absolutely, social media, there's a lot of information, there's a lot of misinformation, and I'll say it right now. If I was listening to some of the influencers on social media right now, in terms of guiding my decision making, I would not be married with a child right now. I would probably still be out there looking, because there are a lot of horrible and toxic messages about relationships, about marriage as an institution, about Black women and about Black men, unfortunately. But like I said, I think that there are some pretty influential folks out there that are doing some great work. But I think we really do need to ask our fathers, who is it that they're listening to? Where are they consuming their information? And how is this guiding them? Because, for a lot of these fatherhood programs, you might be meeting with fathers one day a week, twice a week. Maybe you're meeting with them 5 days a week. They may be listening to these influencers a lot more than they're hearing messages from these fatherhood programs. And so I think that definitely needs to be part of the conversation.
Let me break in here. We're going to move into some of these questions. I'm trying to see the ones that I think that have been addressed in some ways. But I want to bring this one in here. As a mother of a young son and daughter, what are the reasons why Black women are 50% more likely to have a college degree than Black men, excluding the prison system? So I'm going to throw that grenade in there and duck. So how about it?
I think it's a lot. So and I'll be very quick. So I'll say, one, I think we need to acknowledge that just the education system, in many ways, speaks to speaks to the way women tend to learn and women tend to communicate on average. In terms of reading and writing, I think our boys tend to have different ways of doing that, tend to learn more active, for example. And so I think many times, me, myself, I've struggled in undergrad. And so I think there's a factor there. In terms of learning styles, I think that a lot of these institutions tend to speak more to the way women learn and engage with material. But I'll also acknowledge Black women are smart. Black women are smart. They're smart crew. And it's no accident that they do really well in academics, and we should appreciate, praise, and celebrate that, absolutely. But yes, I think again, this sort of goes beyond just college institutions. but even the way our elementary schools work, how much is it actually empowering and supporting the way our Black boys learn, the way they engage material, the way they consume material, and the way they express themselves. A lot of times Black boys and Black men are muted, right? Sometimes we're talking too loud, sometimes we're talking too aggressive, sometimes we're too competitive, but a lot of times that's what drives our ability to consume more information, to learn and grow.
Let me throw this one in. Go ahead.
I would add that there's competition between masculinity and being intelligent, and we're sending young boys mixed messages about what it means to be a man, what it means to be masculine, and being smart and being a nerd is counterintuitive to that. And so there's a lot of scholarship that shows where kids of color intentionally dumb themselves down in high achieving academic settings, either to maintain certain ideas around particular identities or in response to challenges to their masculinity. And for me to stand up in front of my classrooms when I lecture and say I'm a nerd, and I embrace that, at the same time embracing other things, I think that makes a challenge where through their childhood K through 12, what they're being told through social media, through their families, through the communities, through the world about what it means to be a man, being intelligent is counter to it, along with obviously there are structural problems in education that disenfranchise Black boys away from education, that it's not a space, it's not welcoming for them. They're not welcome in that space, and that's why there's so few of us who end up in college, much less many of us, with those of us with PhDs and EDDs, like that is very rare, unfortunately.
So let me move to this one. How do we fight the negative stigma that Black men should only be a provider or protector? We're also nurturers when it comes to our children. So that this whole notion of the dad is kind of pulled in to be the disciplinarian and the enforcer, and less of a nurturer. So David is asking that question. How do we push back on that narrative?
Well, sometimes it's difficult. I can speak for myself as a single father, and having two girls and a boy. It was difficult for me to embrace my children and hug them, not because I didn't want to, just because I didn't know how, and it felt very awkward. And so that's something that they have to be taught. It's not something that they inherit. Things have changed throughout the years as it comes to men and women. Where men used to be the breadwinner, one makes the money and be the person and the wife stays home. Now women making more money than men, and so how do you deal with that balance? And there's some fathers that stay home and the mother go to work because the mother makes more money, and he can feel secure in himself to know that that's okay, because we're a team and we're working together. And so that's, but then that part where we're supposed to be the disciplinary, I know a lot of fathers that are nurturers. I know a lot of fathers, that hug their children and tell them that they love them, but it's kind of hard to do that when you haven't been exposed to that and you haven't had that. So that's something that, we have to practice, and it may be awkward at first, but the more you do it, the easier it gets.
Yeah, I think one of the other things is we have to what's going to change that perception is us being realistic about the values that we put on all three of those things from both moms and dads, right? Because we both bring all of those. Moms both protect, provide, and nurture in their own way. Dads protect, provide, and nurture in their own way, right? The issue with fathers is how we value what we term as protection, provision, and nurturing as men, right? And so you mentioned, if I hug my child, to some people, they don't see that as nurturing, right? They see that as other things, and they'd rather see you put $25 in their bank account than hug your children, right? And so until we become realistic about the value and the definition that we place on those three terms equal to that of moms, and then collectively to that as co-parents, we're going to always have this issue with what expectations people have of us as fathers.
I'm going to try and do this one in a double. How do we, one, navigate, more Black men into these kinds of jobs so that begin to support Black fathers in these spaces? And how do you start to teach, Black youth to open their own businesses, especially if education and employment are major barriers?
What we do is, go ahead. You take it, Ken.
I'll slow the roll. Don't leave too much space. Up in there. But it was something that I wanted to say before, and that is one of the things that we have to recognize is that level of education is being challenged by level of experience, influence, and opportunity, right? And so what we have placed on education in the past as an asset to doing this work might quite possibly not be such an asset anymore when you're looking, in this case, for Black men to do this work, right? Who may make a decision about not going to college because they've gone through some issue in their lives, i.e. fathers who've gone through child support, custody battles, those things, who actually want to work with dads and find themselves in organizations that they can't function in because they don't have the other skill sets to do that, but still have the passion and drive to kind of do this work and want to do this work. We have to find a way to marry the necessities that we need from education with the realities of the experiences that our people bring to the table and find some common ground to begin to start infiltrating our staff and our not-for-profit space with individuals that can learn from each other.
And that's like providing some type of trade. I mean, everybody's not going to go to college. Everybody is not book savvy. But what we do is, at Man to Man, is we provide apprenticeship programs for them. So we teach them how to do carpentry, electrical, plumbing, concrete masonry. We're giving them a tool, and we're giving them skills so that they can go out, and these are guys that come out of prison that actually are felons where society writes them off, and they come out making $50 an hour. So and then they can move into that entrepreneurship because now they have this skill, and now they can utilize this skill to go into business to provide for their families.
Yeah, I would say we just have to continue to dismantle this cultural barrier that views men's participation within the family as like breadwinners and providers, right? We also have to see ourselves as assets when you think about caregiving professions, right? Over the last several decades, research demonstrates that women have been moving into some traditionally male-dominated jobs, but men have not moved as fast in traditionally female-dominated jobs, right? But it doesn't mean that men do not possess the ability to be like teachers, to be social workers, to be kindergarten or pre-kindergarten teachers, right? I do a lot of work around father-centered home visiting programs, right? I spend a lot of time thinking about how can I take men, fathers, and create an employment opportunity for them as home visitors, right? But a lot of this has to do with the money that is made available within the workforce, right? Because it has a lot to do with men feeling as if this is a viable employment opportunity for themselves that moves beyond a minimum wage job, right? This is something that will provide a living, family sustaining wage. It's something that they can see themselves having a career in. And going to the other question, right, related to, entrepreneurship, that is going to be key, in my opinion. I know for a fact, and I'm assuming that many of my co-panelists can, confirm the point I'm about to make. a lot of the guys that we work with are brilliant, right? Like they have ideas that exist in their mind and in their head they are trying to bring out into the world, but unfortunately they don't always have an avenue of expression and opportunity. So the extent to which our fatherhood programs can serve as conduits that will allow these men to take some of the business ideas that they have, right, and put them on paper, help them to develop business plans, help them to get connected with folks who may be willing to invest in some of the ingenious ideas that they have, right? How do we get a group of fathers in programming to come together in a collaborative fashion to build out a cohesive business plan, right? Where everybody in a cohort, for example, can be a part of a business project that they can say that they were a part of, something that they brought into existence by hard work and diligence and perseverance and support from those individuals and institutions who see value in the ideas that these men are trying to bring into the world.
I think in agreement, I think you have to destigmatize what success means, right? And pushing schools, especially K through 12, to educate, young children about how they can take care of themselves and their families. And not everyone's going to be a Jeff Bezos, but that taking care of their families can be done in a variety of ways. But if they have to be supported in that, and that information has to be brought to them easily. And I think pushing schools and school districts to connect with people in the community. So I know in Pittsburgh, the trade guild is trying to be really active in cultivating apprenticeship programs through the high schools. And these, in a city like Pittsburgh, steel workers, and tradesmen make a lot of really good money. And, and up until deindustrialization, you could buy homes, send your kids to college without going to college yourself by working in those industries.
So we're like right at time, maybe a minute over. I know there are still a lot of questions in the Q&A, but I just want to take this time to just say thank you to our panelists for just an amazing conversation, some great points. I think that broadly, some of the questions in the Q&A were addressed. There are still a few more, but I think this is a conversation that's super comprehensive and we could talk about it all day in terms of where we can land in terms of solutions. And so I want to bring back to this dialogue, Brother White, to now talk about like next steps and where do we go from here. But thank you all again to our panel for taking the time.
Wow. I came on this morning wondering what I was going to talk about for 10 minutes. And now I'm wondering, how can we squeeze everything that we want to talk about in 10 minutes? So I'll make an attempt here. Where do we go from here? Thank you to all you panelists. You guys, I went through like a whole pencil over here. So first question I wanted to propose, because this is going to be very conversational in regards to where do we go from here, is how do we call out the racism which informs policy? Several of you made really good points around that. And I think that this center might be well equipped to do that work. So what can we give to this center to help them try to call out, shine a light on the racism which affects these policies? Is that something where we're doing some campaign or advocacy work around that? How do we get them to admit that these policies come from a place of racism? And then how do we get them to address that, them being policymakers?
Well, I don't know if the people in power are going to admit that the policies are racist.
Sure.
But
Sure.
I think, I'm borrowing from like Kimberly Crenshaw and critical race theory, right? That very clearly and very methodically lays out, how policies come into place, how they originate. So we have to understand the origins of democracy, the origins of capitalism, that then inform social institutions, that inform education, and how, the expulsion that leads to the school or prison pipeline, right? And the way in which people, and so I think it's constantly being in tune with those and tying them in directly to, some of the great work that some of the fellow panelists are doing in the organizations in the community.
Yeah.
And I think we have to do that methodically.
Yeah.
Very
One of the other
good.
things that
Absolutely.
you can explore, right, is, so there's a lot of conversation now about diversity, inclusion, and equity, right? And, one of the things that I've learned since being here in Atlanta, coming out of New York, from a much more diverse population, and being in Atlanta and now not being diverse and not having to be diverse because it is the nature of the beast. Just being able to kind of clearly understand and be okay with, understanding where diversity helps and where diversity hurts. Like we think that diversity, and we talk about DEI like it's the answer and key to everything. It's not the answer and key to all things. So when my child comes home with a bad report card, I don't have to bring in other families from my neighborhood to assess the issue, right? That would be diversity and inclusion of everybody in my community. So when we're talking about issues that are specifically related to Black families, Black men, Black fathers, Black children, Denzel Washington was asked some time ago, I saw him in the meme, he was talking about, a person asked him a question about why does there need to be a Black director of some movie? I can't remember what it was, but his response was, because everything is not about content. Some things is about context. So Goodfellas, right, could have been directed by him or any other Black director. But what Martin Scorsese brought to the conversation was context. And so we really got to be careful and clear about when we're talking about Black families, Black fathers in this conversation, Black mothers, Black children, who's at the table and who's giving context to the content.
Very good. And I have a similar question too, just what can this center do to change this narrative? We've talked about this narrative. Actually yourself, Brother Braswell, you just talked about how, 73% is the number of, according to results from these studies, of uninvolved dads, and that's not true. We know this not to be true. What can we do as a center? What can we do as a collective to challenge that narrative? Is it, our own study that we do? Is it something we need to take that study, do a deeper dive? What do you think we can do to challenge that narrative, to change the narrative?
One thing I'll say is that I think in a lot of my work, so for example, I'm doing a project called the Reframe Project, where I am, along with my team, working with OPRE, really working with experts in the community, healthy marriage and responsible fatherhood programs, and other service providers, to really understand how some of these programs can better serve Black fathers, mothers, youth, and couples. And so we're trying to really access and explore how these programs operate, what are some of the needs in the community. But I think one of the things we learned early on was that, we really want to dispel or challenge these common negative narratives. But the thing is, some of the narratives can come about even in the way you ask questions. As a researcher, what kind of questions are you asking? So just in terms of getting institutions to admit the racism that they did, right? That sort of brings about a narrative about sort of this deficit model, right? But there is a strength in our communities that we haven't quite captured, a strength in some of the programs that we've heard about today that we may not have captured. Like, yes, they're doing all this great work, but how is that work being done? How is that work informing or supporting the natural drive that families and individuals already have. So are we asking, for example, what is it that these families, these individuals are actually doing right now that really is supporting our communities? So for example, I just sort of thinking about really good movies that demonstrate this point. I think about Bebe's Kids a lot. Bebe's Kids was a very important movie to me because it was a movie about a man who was just pursuing a woman who had all these kids, none of them biologically attached to him. None of them, not her kid and not Bebe's kids. But his story arc, his redemptive arc was becoming a supportive figure in the lives of these children. How much are we honoring fathers who are doing that? They are stepfathers, or maybe they're not married to their child's mother, this child's mother, but they are boyfriends, they are uncles, they are really supportive forces in these children's lives. Do we recognize them as fathers or father figures? Like, even the way we define fathers has to expand. And so who is it that's providing the support? How is it that they're providing this support? And how are human service programs adapting their approaches that speak to the cultural realities of Black families? That's another question that I think we really need to get into. That's really important, that I think that will really aid some of these strength-based narratives.
Got you. And we're speeding through this 10-minute period already, so I'm going to jump ahead. This is one I think you guys can sink your teeth into. A question I had is, so we talked about custody being influenced by public assistance and child support, right? How do we change public assistance? We talked about incentivizing single parenthood, things of that nature. How do we make changes there on a policy level that can positively impact custody? Anybody can just, maybe that's too tough a question. And I apologize. I get excited about this. So let's look at this.
It's not a tough
We
question.
talked
No,
about
it's
single
not a
parent.
tough
It's not a
question.
tough question. It's a deep question. It's a
Right,
deep
right,
question.
right. Yeah.
Go ahead, Bright. I think that was you. Yeah, whichever one.
Yeah, what I was gonna say is it depends, we have to bring it to the table, and we have to be open. I mean, the people who's making these decisions about, child support, public assistance, they're looking at it from a perspective as a worker, but they're not understanding the individuals who's involved and engaged as far as the fathers and the mothers are concerned. So they need to see that side as well, so that they can have a full perspective of what they're dealing with. And even when I was talking to the woman from director from Child Support Services, after I had the conversation with her, is when she came out and said, you know what, you need to talk to my employees, because they're looking at it from an employee perspective rather than a client's perspective, or a person who's actually in, the process of trying to take care of their children and may not have the funds. So I think when you're having these people that come to the table, one, they have to be open-minded to understand that what they're dealing with, because they're not going to make a change unless they understand all the logistics of what involves with the parents and the child support services, and then see it from their point of view. Maybe they'll have some empathy and then begin to start changing some of these policies.
I like that.
I would quickly add, a lot of the solutions to these problems already exist, or some proposed solutions exist on the pages of some of our top fatherhood scholars, right? If you think about somebody like a David Pate, you think about somebody like a Ron Mincy, you think about somebody like a Waldo Johnson, a Kirk Harris. I can keep going on and on and on, right? I think it's just very important for us to center the work, the scholarship of those researchers who've been doing this work for the last several decades, but also connect it with some of the new and emerging scholarship that has come to bear that speaks to, one, allowing 100% of a father's child support payments to go to the family, right? Don't charge interest on the child support payments. You know, forgive government owed child support debt. Ensure all parents feel heard and respected in court. Recognize that parents want to support their children, right? Make the child support system more welcoming by transforming it into a family building institution. Because while the name says child support, it unfortunately does the complete opposite, right? And again, this is for the child support, the public child support system, right? Those families who may be receiving government assistance for a variety of reasons. But we also have to do this in concert with the men, with the non-custodial parents who 80% of the time are fathers, right? Do it in concert with them because they are the ones who are deeply impacted and negatively affected by these systems. And so nothing for them without them, right? And I do think that this is the value of like a community-based participatory research framework, right? And I know that that's something that's central to what Latrice is and the team is planning to do with this center. So I just want to continue to encourage you all to move in that direction.
And I think you've done that. I thank all of you panelists for your participation. You've given us so many nuggets, so much knowledge, so much information. I oftentimes see these recorded Zoom calls and I don't necessarily go back and view them, but I'm definitely going to spend some time digesting this, and I encourage everybody else to do the same. I know that there were some questions that went unanswered, some really good questions, but this is an opportunity for us to all connect and reconnect to get some answers to some of these questions and continue the work. I have several things that I want to touch on that we don't have time to do. But again, I thank everybody, and we're actually going to turn this over to Dr. Rollins right now to close us out.
Wow, thank you all so much. Thank you to all of the panelists. Thank you, Dr. Washington, as moderator. I'm trying to keep this conversation somewhat contained. I appreciate you, as well as the questions and answers. Thank you for all of the participants who have stayed on. And thank you, Chris, for your call to action and for serving as one of our technical work group members of the center so that we make sure that fathers are at the forefront and involved in the research that we conduct at the center. So at this time, you all, we would love for you to give us feedback, not only on today's session, but also on the overall conference, if you were able to attend yesterday and today. So please take time to go to the chat, click on that message, and complete the evaluation survey for us. All right, you all, this has been a phenomenal time, phenomenal first conference for the National African American Child and Family Research Center. I look forward to engaging with all of you. Again, please feel free to join our social media. You will see a lot of what we have coming up on those pages. I look forward to partnering with all of you. What's very clear to me is that we need to all be working together to advance a lot of the things that we've been talking about these past 2 days. So please feel free to connect with us. And again, thank you so much again for joining us. Have a wonderful day.